this is a big release. This is equivalent to more than 100 Hiroshima bombs, at least equivalent of a 1 megaton nuclear explosion.
My estimate is that overall, upwards of 100,000 extra cancers will develop as a result of this accident. Of these, only a small number, perhaps 500, might occur in the UK.
The view of two of the world's leading nuclear scientists on the aftermath of the Chernobyl disaster. Tonight, as the dust settles, World in Action presents the results of the first full independent study into the spread of radiation and its effect on people of the world's worst nuclear accident. An accident the nuclear establishment said was practically impossible.
Initially, there was a catastrophic explosion which sort of blew the reactor contents out. That initial explosion would have opened up the top of the reactor, blown a lot of fissile material and debris. Then thereafter, because of the tremendous heat inside the reactor, that would have sort of caused a plume of hot air to rise and put all the material very high up into the atmosphere, say 10,000 feet.
Dr. John Large is an independent engineer working on the design of nuclear power stations, and for 8 years did research work for the Atomic Energy Authority.
2 tons of fissile material was blown into the atmosphere during that explosion and subsequent period. If you look for comparisons here, that 2 tons is at least 50 times greater than any previous nuclear explosion that we've had up to date.
But it wasn't until 3 days later that routine testing at nuclear establishments across Europe gave the first hint of the catastrophe that had taken place. Since then, at least 13 people have died, and tens of thousands of acres have become useless. Hundreds of thousands of gallons of milk have been thrown away. Tons of vegetables have been destroyed. But the long-term effects on human beings are only now beginning to be assessed. Last week, World in Action commissioned 3 specialists who work for neither the government nor the nuclear industry to analyze all the available data and to calculate for us just what the long-term consequences of Chernobyl are likely to be. First, we went to New York to speak to Dr. Jan B.A., one of the world's foremost authorities on predicting how radiation spreads through the atmosphere. Back in Britain, we consulted Professor Edward Radford, also an American now working in England. He's acknowledged as the world's leading expert on how radiation affects humans. And in Oxford, Peter Taylor, who has access to the official computer program used by the National Radiological Protection Board to predict how radiation spreads after an accident.
Well, from the data that has been collected all over Europe for radioactivity in Sweden, Denmark, Italy and so forth, we've worked backwards to get some idea of how much radioactivity could have been released from the reactor at Chernobyl itself. And it was immediately obvious that a catastrophic release, a meltdown, thousands of times larger than any other accident that had ever occurred, and indeed many times that of a nuclear weapon test.
But how far and in what concentrations had this unprecedented cloud of radiation spread over Europe? The least predictable factor for the experts was the weather. The radioactivity from Chernobyl was carefully monitored at the headquarters of the Meteorological Office at Bracknell. It was an international operation, and the findings were circulated to government departments at home and abroad.
During the first day after the explosion, the movement of the radiation at below cloud level was towards northwest. This was over here. During the second day, the radiation moved up across the southern Baltic and reached as far as southern Finland. On the third day, this radiation spread even further west towards southern Sweden. At the same time, it began to move from the Chornobyl area towards the northeast as well, towards Moscow, in fact. And during day 4 and day 5, northeasterly winds began to carry the radiation southwestwards across Poland and towards the Alps in Central Europe. So that at the end of day 6, in fact, the radiation had reached most of southern France. It wasn't, in fact, until day 7 when the radiation from this direction spread across eastern England. And then it moved northwards across northern England and southern Scotland. And during the period after that time, under the influence of northeasterly winds, the radiation spread southwestwards across the Atlantic.
So 2 weeks after the disaster at Chernobyl, virtually the whole of Europe had been affected to some degree by the spread of radioactivity from the accident. The alarm caused spontaneous demonstrations in half a dozen European capitals. In West Germany, farmers blockaded the border with the East in the face of a threat that had no respect for frontiers. In Poland, mothers queued for hours to get iodine tablets for their children. And in every affected country, the scientists began a program of checks and tests for contamination. What started as tests on food exports from the worst affected areas soon resulted in a ban on many food imports into all but one of the common market countries. But in Britain, there was a belief that everything was all right.
In simple terms, people are asking, is it safe to drink milk? The answer is yes. Is it safe to drink water from the tap? The answer is yes. Is it necessary for children to take iodine tablets? The answer is no.
Such assurances did not completely satisfy the public. There's been widespread anxiety about fresh vegetables and milk, and opinion polls have shown that most people were less confident than the politicians. We asked Professor Radford to analyse all the scientific data and to calculate just what the effect on the people of Europe would be. After a week's work examining all the readings made available by the British and European governments, he came up with some disturbing predictions.
I would think that on the basis of the numbers I have at this time, upwards of 100,000 people may develop cancer that would not have otherwise.
We then asked Professor Radford to calculate in more detail the impact on people in the immediate vicinity of the Chernobyl reactor.
Some people have already died of radiation effects that have occurred, and these radiation effects lead to a particularly nasty, unpleasant form of death. In addition, there may well be women who are pregnant at the time who will undergo miscarriage if they received a high enough dose. Also, there is the potential for genetic damage to the people in that area so that they will have a higher risk of giving birth later to children who may have abnormalities arising from genetic defects. And from the best estimates of radiation exposures that I have at this time, I would say that upwards of 20 to 30,000 extra cancers will occur in this population in the vicinity of the reactor, say up to 20 kilometers or 12 miles.
And how many of those people would you expect to die from those cancers?
About a third to a half of those extra cancers will be fatal.
But the contamination in this immediate area would have been even worse, but for one unexpected factor that saved many local people. But it was to have implications further afield.
The initial heat of the fire, again, this is something that would not normally be predicted, drove much of the radioactivity very high over the first few kilometers. This was very fortunate for the people in the nearby town of Pripyat, because had it been a low-level release, then they would have been subjected to a lethal dose. As it was, it appears that they were somewhat fortunate and were below the level of acute effects. The material appears to have been driven up into the higher atmosphere, and therefore it's actually gone further and perhaps more quickly.
Much of it landed several days later in the surrounding countries. So we next asked Professor Radford to assess the wider health implications across Western Europe.
Looking at the countries most affected, such as Austria, Italy, West Germany, and the Scandinavian countries, it looks to me as though there may be as many as 10,000 extra cancers that will develop as a result of this exposure. This number has to be set against the expected number of cancers that would have occurred without the Chernobyl disaster. And those numbers we can estimate, say for 100 million people affected, would be upwards of 30 million cancers that would normally have occurred anyway. So we're only talking about 10,000 extra cancers out of 30 million, proportionately a very small number.
We can't know.
To accurately assess the effects on British people, Professor Radford had first to take account of the complicated weather patterns over this country a week and a half after the explosion. That information came from the Met Office.
This now is the situation in the middle of day 10. The air that was carried across northern Scotland and out into the Atlantic has been caught up in the circulation of this depression, more or less stationary to the west of Ireland, and is being brought back round the circulation so that we get a double dose of the cloud into the southern part of Britain.
Professor Radford also made detailed use of extensive measurements of radiation levels over the whole of Britain. These were taken by scientists reporting to the National Radiological Protection Board.
From the extensive measurements that have been carried out in the UK, we can come up with fairly good estimates of how many extra cancers will occur here as a result of the fallout from Chornobyl. And the indications are that the amount of radioactivity is comparable to the amount that was released at the time of the Windscale fire in 1957. That in itself is a significant comparison because here we're dealing with a reactor that was 2,000 miles away. But the result is clearly that the number of excess cancers is about comparable, namely roughly 500.
Excessive rainfall in the north of Britain brought more radiation down with it and meant that those areas were exposed more than the south, which stayed dry.
If you were a farmer in one of those places, say in Cumbria or Scotland, and your cows were out in the pasture, would you drink the milk from your cows?
Well, there were a few milk measurements which were relatively high, and in those few instances where the person would be drinking the milk directly from the cow and not mixing it into a large pool that would be going to market. Under those circumstances, I think I would advise the farmer to take the cows in from the fields and for a day or two not drink the milk.
Would you let your kids, you're the farmer now, would you let your kids drink that milk?
It's the children that one would be particularly concerned about because the radiation exposures to children and infants are much higher than they are for adults.
Would you let your kids drink that milk?
No.
In the longer term, the main question now facing the West is what can our nuclear industry learn from the Russian disaster? So far, politicians have been concerned to distance our technology and standards from those of the Russians, with the suggestion that safety standards there would be quite unacceptable here.
But he will be the first to be aware that the reactor in the Soviet Union is totally different from any kind we have here. And he will be the first to be aware that the record of safety in design, operation and maintenance and inspection of this country is second to none.
Well, that's nonsense. They know it's nonsense. Everyone who hears it knows it's nonsense. And I don't understand how they can still insist on saying that.
But surely they claim there's plenty of containment around British reactors, which there wasn't in the Soviet Union.
If there were an accident in France, the UK would say it couldn't happen there. If there's an accident in the UK, the French will say it won't happen there. Anyone who knows the physics and chemistry of reactor accidents knows that it can happen in any reactor operating in the world today.
Britain now has 38 commercial nuclear reactors of two main types. The latest generation are the AGRs, the Advanced Gas-Cooled Reactor. But the first reactors to be constructed were the Magnox type, and it's these which many experts feel are the least safe. One of the main arguments about the relative safety of different reactors focuses on the question of something called secondary containment. The Russian reactors of the type which blew up at Chornobyl have a single steel containment vessel, but then two further so-called biological shields, all of which were breached, blasting harmful radiation into the atmosphere. The British AGR reactors work under less internal pressure, but only have a single and enormously thick combined pressure vessel and biological shield. They have no secondary containment. The other British reactors, the older Magnox type, have a single steel containment and a further biological shield. But this is complicated by the fact that they do not completely contain all the workings of the reactor.
Chernobyl had a massive explosion which ripped open its containment and its secondary containment as well. If we had a similar explosion in a British reactor here, it also would rip open, I'm sure, the pressure vessel. And the British reactors have no secondary containment.
Are you in effect saying that some British reactors may be at risk?
There's quite a deal of controversy about the Magnox reactors and their weaknesses in terms of their pressure circuits being outside any form of containment. So there is doubt about the integrity of the Magnox reactors at this time. These are our oldest reactors.
One of these Magnox reactors is located in this remote valley in North Wales. It's been there so long that it's almost become part of the scenery. Before Chernobyl, there was little local concern, but now all that has changed. A week after the Russian accident, 400 local people turned out, demanding the closure of the Transvernith plant.
Well, 6 months ago, I seemed to be the only one who was making the running around here on this. I even had local CND members writing to the newspaper telling me to shut up. But post-Chernobyl, last Saturday, we had 400 local people here at the gates of the power station here, clamouring for it to be closed down. And those are real people. That isn't CND rent-a-crowd. We had doctors, teachers, nurses. We had farmers from around the local area here. People genuinely concerned with this place, that they're worried about it.
The rising concerns of local people is something which the power station manager readily acknowledges.
People were coming into our district survey laboratory and asking to be monitored personally. People were bringing in milk samples to have them analysed.
Were people panicking?
Panicking, I think, is perhaps an extreme word, but people were deeply concerned. I was aware that a number of them were going to the local doctors asking for iodine tablets or iodine in some form.
But the horrors of the Russian accident have done nothing to shake the conviction of the manager that the Transvernith plant is completely safe.
Could a Chernobyl-type accident happen here?
Most emphatically not. We don't have a similar type reactor system here at Transvernith.
But how can you be so sure it wouldn't happen?
Any accident requires certain factors at the beginning of the scenario, and we simply don't have those factors here at Transvernith to enable such a scenario to develop.
You say it couldn't happen here, but before the Chernobyl accident, the International Atomic Energy Agency, they said an accident at Chernobyl was practically impossible. How can you be so sure that it couldn't happen here?
A reactor system such as being built in Russia would not receive licensing in this country. That we can be most emphatic about.
But the manager's confidence, which is in line with that of the government and the Central Electricity Generating Board, is not shared by many of the experts.
The British government has said that they rejected the design for the Chernobyl reactor because it wasn't up to scratch by British standards.
No, that's not the reason. Look, different countries have developed different types of reactor. The Americans have developed the PWR, the pressurized water reactor. The British have developed the gas-cooled reactor, and the Russians have developed this Leningrad-type reactor. It's that we've all developed different subspecies of the same beast, effectively.
Anyone who knows anything about physics or chemistry knows that an accident can happen in Britain. Whether we will have such an accident, whether you will have such an accident, we don't know yet as to the probabilities of failure. But in a theoretical sense, anyone who says an accident that will release as much radioactivity as at Chernobyl, so anyone who says that can't happen is talking nonsense.
We wanted to ask the National Radiological Protection Board about the effects of an accident like Chernobyl in this country, but they declined to be interviewed. We also wanted to interview the coordinating minister, Kenneth Baker, about the risks, but he too declined. Instead, we talked to the man responsible for the Nuclear Installations Inspectorate. He proved a little more cautious than the politicians had been.
Well, our job in the whole system is to be professional skeptics. We never allow ourselves to say that this couldn't happen here. Our job is to force the licensees who are responsible for the safety of their reactors to go over the ground very thoroughly and to satisfy us that the risk of anything happening is extremely remote, and to satisfy us in great detail too.
But presumably the risk of an accident such as happened in the Soviet Union was considered extremely remote as well.
Well, I don't think the precise kind of accident that happened in the Soviet Union, insofar as we understand it, and we don't at the moment have a full account, it's very difficult to imagine precisely that accident happening.
So you're saying that it's unlikely that that type of accident could have happened in this country?
Well, it is conceivably possible that an accident on that scale could happen, but so far as we can see, the particular way in which this happened couldn't happen.
Even the most concerned would agree that the chance of a major accident at a power station like Trasvenith is remote. But as Chornobyl and the accident at the American nuclear reactor at 3 Mile Island 7 years ago showed, the seemingly impossible can happen. So we asked our experts to go back to the Radiological Protection Board computer program, feed in all the necessary information, and explain for us the consequences of an accident the size of Chornobyl at the Trasvenith reactor in North Wales. This is what they calculated would happen in such a hypothetical situation with prevailing winds blowing from the west. Even without the changing weather spreading the radioactivity far more extensively, their predictions show that the main plume of radiation would spread right across England and beyond, through one of the most densely populated regions of the country.
The radioactivity would spread in a plume downwind of the reactor, so that if the wind were blowing from the southwest, the radioactivity would be taken in a cloud over the main centres of population, Manchester, Liverpool. It would cross the Pennines, it would cross the whole of Britain. Indeed, it could even reach Denmark and still be potent enough to cause restrictions on agriculture at that distance.
Well, obviously, it's a disaster of major magnitude. It might well require evacuation of substantial urban areas, such as Chester and other areas like that. And there would also be the agricultural impact, the fact that radioactivity deposited on the soil would make it difficult or impossible to continue to use that land for quite a long period of time for agriculture.
The computer program simplifies everything. What we end up with is an ideal plume, maintaining a single wind direction and out to various distances. Of course, in reality, the wind will shift and it will move the plume, thus effectively diluting it, but at the same time moving it across different towns over different distances. And indeed, as we've seen in Chornobyl, it can move all the way around the compass in every direction.
Professor Radford then looked at the projections for the spread of radiation and gave us a more detailed estimate of what the effect of such a hypothetical accident would be.
In close to the reactor, say within 20 kilometers or 12 miles, we might well have severe effects, immediate effects on people, death, miscarriages, and then, of course, a relatively high risk of cancer developing in that population later on. Beyond 10 miles or so, depending on which way the wind blew the cloud, you might be exposing very large populations to lower doses, but still with a very significant cancer risk developing in that population as well. And for that reason, it might be necessary to evacuate these people in order to keep their radiation exposures as low as possible. Certainly to Chester and Liverpool, there could be significant radiation exposure, additional cancers in the tens of thousands. Beyond that point, say to the suburbs of Manchester, there could be additional risk. And then as you go beyond that, farther into the northwest, northeast, the cancer risk would go down and might be small, but still you're dealing with very large populations being exposed to it.
Do you think it's reasonable to interpret this type of computer program for a British reactor, or do you think it's really alarmist and unnecessary?
I think one of the benefits is that it shows you just what the consequences would be in terms of whether or not you should evacuate and what level of agricultural restrictions that one should apply. So certainly we have been criticised for being alarmist in the past, and it's been put to us that you don't need to plan for these accidents because they're simply not going to happen. And we have said that if they did happen and you hadn't planned for it, then there would be panic and the consequences would be quite horrific. So in our view, it's been irresponsible of not to plan.
I can't see how anybody today, living in Britain or many other countries for that matter, can't view such bland assurances with great suspicion, because that's exactly what the Russian government was telling its people and indeed the international community about the Chornobyl reactor.
Don't you think you're being alarmist?
Well, I would like to be able to say to the British people on this program that the government does have everything under control, that they have no reason to fear a similar accident here. The only trouble is that my experience in this field has taught me that oftentimes the unexpected does occur.
9 died, 300 were injured at Chernobyl. The Russians expel an American for spying. Mr. Gorbachev went on Soviet television tonight to talk for the first time about the Chernobyl disaster, saying 9 people had died in the accident and 299 were still in hospital. The Soviet leader said Chernobyl gave mankind its first taste of nuclear energy out of control and showed what an abyss would open for mankind if there were ever a nuclear war. Mr. Gorbachev called for international cooperation to ensure no repeat of Chernobyl. He suggested a prompt warning system on accidents, an expanded International Atomic Energy Agency, and a major conference to discuss the problems. Mr. Gorbachev said he was extending the Soviet Union's moratorium on nuclear testing, and he called on President Reagan to meet him, possibly at Hiroshima, where the first atomic bomb fell, to discuss an immediate test ban.
Soviet television news tonight was satellited around the globe. Suddenly, without introduction, the Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev, at last speaking about Chernobyl. His tone was calm, almost sorrowful. There was sympathy for victims, praise for Soviet citizens, gratitude for international support, but criticism of Western reaction, plans for nuclear energy safeguards, and an appeal to talk on nuclear arms with President Reagan. But first, what went wrong on April the 26th as Chernobyl started a routine shutdown?
Реактора внезапно возросли. Значительное выделение пара и последовавшая затем реакция привели к образованию водорода, его взрыву, разрушению реактора и связанному с этим радиоактивному выбросу.
He expressed gratitude for international help, praising 2 US surgeons by name, then an attack on the West's political reaction.
О чем только не говорилось и не писалось в эти дни. О тысячах жертв, братских могилах погибших, вымершем Киеве, о том, что вся земля Украины отравлена и так далее и тому подобное. В общем, мы столкнулись с настоящим нагромождением лжи, самой бессовестной и злопыхательской.
But the Gorbachev message was practical, with safeguards on nuclear power for the future.
Создать международный режим безопасного развития ядерной энергетики на основе тесного сотрудничества всех государств, занимающихся атомной энергетикой. В рамках такого режима необходимо наладить систему оперативного оповещения и предоставления информации в случае аварии и неполадок на атомных электростанциях, в особенности, когда это сопровождается выходом радиоактивности.
The next step, after Chernobyl, Mr. Gorbachev wants nuclear arms talks with the Americans.
Я подтверждаю свое предложение президенту Рейгану встретиться безотлагательно в столице любого европейского государства, которое будет готово нас принять, или, скажем, в Хиросиме, и договориться о запрете ядерных испытаний.
Mr. Gorbachev was plainly determined to repair damage the Chernobyl incidents caused his country's image by reacting to Western anguish at Soviet secrecy with renewed pressure for a nuclear arms deal. And it's on that condition the invitation to renewed superpower talks is based.
Russia has expelled an American civilian attached to the Defense Department in Moscow, accusing him of spying. They claim Eric Seitz was caught holding a secret meeting with a Russian citizen who'd been recruited by an American intelligence agency, and say his expulsion ended what they called a big espionage action by America against the Soviet Union.
Here, an inquiry has revealed that 8 tons of radioactive gas leaked from the Hinkley Point power station in Somerset last year because of a badly fitting nut and bolt. At the time, staff were given potassium iodate tablets, but the inquiry also found that no one was harmed by the leak. Also today, a reactor at the Sizewell power station in Suffolk was shut down when a defect in a fuel tank was found, and the Agriculture Minister, Mr. Michael Jopling, said the government is reviewing its contingency plans following the Chernobyl disaster. The leak at the Hinkley plant happened last November.
The CEGB said today that 8 tons of radioactive gas escaped from Hinkley Point last November, but they still refused to issue the full report to the internal inquiry team. The leak was caused by a tiny nut and bolt measuring just 1/4 of an inch across, working loose and falling out of a joint. For the first time in Britain, staff were issued with potassium iodate tablets, but the board said this may have been an overreaction. Officials say reports are never released in full because staff would then not feel able to speak freely at leak inquiries.
I think that it is important that our staff have confidence to talk to us freely and frankly when we have this sort of inquiry, so that we establish the facts and we don't get a cover-up.
Tonight, Liberal MP Paddy Ashton said unless the complete report is published, no one can have any faith in the government's promise to have an open policy on nuclear leaks. Peter Hayes, News at 10 at Hinkley Point in Somerset.
Chov tells of the terrors of Chernobyl and warns America we must get together now to control atomic power. Good evening. 18 days after it happened, Mr. Gorbachev preaches the lessons of the Chernobyl disaster. Nuclear explosions, accidental or otherwise, are disastrous, and East and West, he says, must meet to control nuclear energy and nuclear weapons. Will Mr. Gorbachev be believed in America? Did he impress at home? We'll be assessing his performance with Joris Medvedev, Soviet atomic scientist in exile, and Peter Frank of Essex University. And we'll be getting US reaction from Alexander Vershbow of the American Embassy. In the 18 days since the catastrophic explosion at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, the Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev has kept his silence. It's been left to lesser politicians and scientists to inform the Soviet public and the world of the extent and the nature of the disaster, piecemeal. Tonight that changed when viewers of Moscow's 9 o'clock news bulletin saw instead a 25-minute address from the Soviet leader giving his account of the events at Chernobyl. The speech was clearly intended to reassure the Soviet public, but it was also directed at an international audience. On the accident itself, Gorbachev gave new casualty figures, saying that 9 people had died as a result of the explosion and that 299 were still in hospital. That's 90 more than previously admitted. He confirmed that the fire in the damaged reactor was doused and that the 3 other reactors were safe. His proposals for East-West cooperation covered both nuclear power and nuclear weapons. He called for a system of quiet international assistance in the event of nuclear accidents, and he said that the International Atomic Energy Agency should convene a conference to discuss the plan. On arms control, he announced that the Soviet Union would be extending its moratorium on nuclear testing until the 6th of August. And he issued an invitation to President Reagan to meet him as soon as possible in Europe or even in Hiroshima to discuss a comprehensive test ban treaty. Throughout, Gorbachev stressed the enormous destructive force of atomic energy, both in power generation and in weapons. But he began with a technical report on the accident. It added nothing new. He said that no firm conclusion had been reached on causes, and he was careful not to apportion blame.
Серьезность обстановки была очевидной. Надо было срочно и компетентно оценить ее. И как только мы получили надежную первоначальную информацию, она стала достоянием советских людей, была направлена по дипломатическим каналам правительствам зарубежных стран. На основе этой же информации стала развертываться и практическая работа по ликвидации аварии, ограничению ее тяжелых последствий. В сложившейся ситуации мы сочли наипервейшим долгом особой важности обеспечение безопасности населения, оказание эффективной помощи пострадавшим. В считанные часы были эвакуированы жители поселка при станции, а затем, когда стало ясно, что имеется потенциальная угроза здоровью людей в прилегающей зоне, они также были перемещены в безопасный район.
Gorbachev paid particular attention to the way that news of the accident had been received abroad. He praised those countries, particularly the socialist ones, that had offered support. And he thanked the scientific community, singling out Robert Gale, the American bone marrow expert who's been giving advice in Moscow. But praise for an individual contrasted starkly with condemnation of what Gorbachev called the highly immoral campaign mounted by NATO governments and the Western media.
Надо, чтобы международная общественность знала, с чем нам пришлось столкнуться. Надо для того, чтобы ответить на вопрос, чем же на самом деле была продиктована эта в высшей степени аморальная кампания. Ее организаторов, конечно же, не интересовали ни истинная информация об аварии, ни судьбы людей в Чернобыле, на Украине, в Белоруссии, в любом другом месте, любой другой стране. Им нужен был повод для того, чтобы, уцепившись за него, попытаться опорочить Советский Союз, его внешнюю политику, ослабить воздействие советских предложений по прекращению ядерных испытаний, по ликвидации ядерного оружия и одновременно смягчить растущую критику поведения США на международной арене, их милитаристского курса. Если говорить на чистоту, некоторые западные политики преследовали вполне определенные цели. Перекрыть возможности выравнивания международных отношений, посеять семена недоверия и подозрительности к социалистическим странам.
Well, if ritual condemnation of Western coverage and political reaction to the Chernobyl disaster had been expected, Gorbachev's proposals for international cooperation on nuclear safety were much more surprising. Historically, the Soviet Union has been very secretive about its nuclear industry. But here was the General Secretary apparently asking for strict international policing and willing to open the books.
Нужны самые строгие требования везде и во всем. Далее мы считаем необходимым выступить за серьезное углубление сотрудничества в рамках Международного агентства по атомной энергии. О чем можно было бы подумать? Первое. Создать международный режим безопасного развития ядерной энергетики на основе тесного сотрудничества всех государств, занимающихся атомной энергетикой. В рамках такого режима необходимо наладить систему оперативного оповещения и предоставления информации в случае аварии и неполадок на атомных электростанциях, в особенности, когда это сопровождается выходом радиоактивности. В равной мере требуется отладить международный механизм как на двусторонней, так и многосторонней основе в целях быстрейшего оказания взаимной помощи при возникновении опасных ситуаций. Второе. Для обсуждения всего комплекса вопросов было бы оправданным созвать высокоавторитетную специальную международную конференцию в Вене под эгидой МАГАТЭ. Третье. Учитывая, что МАГАТЭ было создано еще в 1957 году, и его ресурсы и штаты не соответствуют уровню развития современной ядерной энергетики, было бы целесообразным повысить роль и возможности этой уникальной международной организации. Советский Союз готов к этому.
Having called for a new deal on nuclear power, Gorbachev turned to nuclear weapons. He said that Chernobyl had revealed the abyss into which nuclear weapons could pitch the world. As a result, he was reinstating the Soviet Union's nuclear test moratorium. This is the moratorium that he'd withdrawn in response to the recent American nuclear test in Nevada. And Gorbachev ended by repeating an offer of nuclear test ban talks, an offer that's already been turned down by Washington.
Стоит во главе США, делом продемонстрирует свою заботу о жизни и здоровье людей. Я подтверждаю свое предложение президенту Рейгану встретиться безотлагательно в столице любого европейского государства, которое будет готово нас принять, или, скажем, в Хиросиме, и договориться о запрете ядерных испытаний. Ядерный век властно требует нового подхода к международным отношениям. Объединение усилий государств различных социальных систем во имя прекращения гибельной гонки вооружений и радикального улучшения мирового политического климата. Тогда расчистятся широкие горизонты плодотворного сотрудничества всех стран и народов. В выигрыше от этого будут все люди Земли.
Peter Frank, what do you think Soviets would have thought of that performance, or is there any way of knowing?
Well, it's very difficult to say, but I think that the mass of the Soviet population, at least in the immediate term, are going to feel fairly reassured by this. It's the first time really since the beginning of the Second World War that a Soviet leader has addressed the people in this kind of way. Now, I think that in itself is going to reassure a lot of people, but it's a very complex society. There are many educated people in that society. There are lots of discrepancies still in Mr. Gorbachev's account. I think that they will ponder hard on them later.
Well, news-wise, what he told us wasn't particularly startling today, but will there have been details there that ordinary Russians won't have heard?
No, I don't think that there is detail there that they won't have heard, but I think it's the very act of his going on television that's important. It's a kind of distillation of the news that they've had for the last 10 days.
And what's the political message? For instance, there had been talk that he would immediately look for a scapegoat, perhaps the party chief in the Ukraine. What sort of message do you get?
Well, I don't think Soviet politics works like that. In fact, the properties of the Soviet political system are rather like those of nuclear fallout. You don't see an obvious dramatic immediate effect, but the long-term consequences can be substantial.
Well, Boris Medvedev, from your point of view, what did you gather in that speech about the future of nuclear energy in the Soviet Union? So far, we've been told the program will go ahead. Is that so clear now?
No, it's not clear. In general, this is, of course, kind of damage control speech to present that Soviet Union is doing everything which is possible under very difficult circumstances. But what is not clear is the future of Soviet nuclear energy program, because in general press, by radio and television, scientists were talking that we will go the same way, our plans remain intact. The remaining 3 nuclear power stations will be started as soon as possible. Nothing of this kind Gorbachev told now, and it's quite clear that the government and Politburo now reassessing the program of very rapid construction of nuclear power station, because they can't afford the second accident like this. So I think that what people realize, and people actually start to worry much more about nuclear power stations nearby, because they were built near very big cities like Leningrad, like Kiev, like Voronezh, like Kursk, and Minsk, and so on. So people who live there start to worry much more now than they were worrying about this before.
Well, in the beginning, the Russians were accused of a cover-up on this issue. Now that we've heard Mr. Gorbachev's words, do you think that any of those allegations still stand?
I think they still stand, because it's very late. He could make the speech 10 days ago, and it'd be quite the same. So actually, in this sense, it's not a very early speech which would be welcome as opening, as kind of frankness and publicity. It's very late.
Well, the Soviet Union has been very selective, rather very secretive in the past about the access it gives to its nuclear industry. Now there's an offer of international policing, so to speak. What do you think about Mr. Gorbachev's suggestion about the international atomic energy?
Yeah, I think he did realize quite clearly that Soviet Union can't survive a nuclear age without international cooperation, because the Soviet Union did consult foreign agencies about how to extinguish fire and graphite, and got advice which is identical to what they're using, boron and some other things. Soviet Union did ask advice how to prevent meltdown, and did get help in medical sense, because Soviet Union apparently doesn't have bank of bone marrow bank. So it did have help, and realized that it's help very, very necessary.
But I mean, is the International Atomic Energy Agency the agency that would most effectively monitor nuclear power?
If it be reorganized, as Gorbachev suggested, to support it, to give more funds, because this agency which Soviet Union is member of, so it's certainly the agency which Soviet Union would be not embarrassed to cooperate with.
Well, Peter Frank, what about the attacks Gorbachev made on the West? Do you think they were justified?
Well, I think that there has been a certain amount of hyping in some of the Western media, but on the whole, I think that people have been very sympathetic to the plight of the Soviet Union and certainly to the plight of the Soviet people, and I think that that was largely unjustified. But I think it's also a fairly constant ingredient of Soviet life, this notion of the Soviet Union surrounded by hostile powers.
And briefly, do you think it was a speech which really made an offer that the Americans are likely to believe, or was it simply a bit of propaganda to impress the rest of the West?
Everything that he said in that respect, he said before. The American position, I believe, is quite clear on that. I don't think that they're likely to respond in the way that he is intending.
Alexander Vershbow, anything new there for the Americans?
Well, no. As far as the nuclear testing moratorium offer is concerned, we had heard this all before, as Peter Frank has said. The same proposal was made at the end of March. And our position is well known. We have told the Soviet Union many times and said publicly that we don't believe that a nuclear test moratorium is the priority issue on the arms control agenda today. Rather, what we're looking for now is for the Soviet Union to begin negotiating in earnest on reductions in existing arsenals at the Geneva talks. And unfortunately, since the summit in November, the Soviet Union has virtually sat on its hands. There's been absolutely no movement in the talks. They have not responded to some of the proposals we put forward, and I think that's where the priority should be focused.
So his dramatic suggestion of a meeting in Hiroshima isn't going to happen?
Well, I think that was a somewhat capricious offer, given the history of Hiroshima. I don't think that would necessarily be the most appropriate place to have a U.S.-Soviet summit. But in any case, the point is he has ignored the summit that he already agreed to in November. We've been waiting for almost 7 months now for the Soviet Union to set a date for the next summit, which will cover the whole range of issues on the U.S.-Soviet agenda, and not merely nuclear testing. That is one issue. We're prepared to talk about that. In fact, we have many offers outstanding that they have ignored entirely to talk about nuclear testing.
But if you continue to slap him down every time he offers to have talks on particular issues, is it likely there's going to be a summit meeting at all this year?
Well, I don't think we have slapped him down on all the other proposals. For instance, last fall, the Soviets proposed a very interesting scheme for 50% cuts in strategic arsenals. We countered with an offer that picked up on a lot of the elements of that proposal, and then that's been dismissed out of hand by the Soviets. So I think it's the Soviets that have been dismissing U.S. initiatives.
But after Chernobyl, does not one have to rethink the whole debate? Are there not totally new terms now? And has he, for instance, not admitted that this explosion has shaken the whole Soviet system itself?
Well, those aspects of his speech were very interesting. I agree. It was a historic speech, and I think one has to give him his due for coming forward and being candid with the Soviet people and stating just how serious the problem was. And I'm relieved, as everyone else is, that that we're out of danger. As far as the arms control negotiations are concerned, I would say that we would agree. This does underscore the need to move ahead and find ways to
Right, Alexander Vershbow, thank you very much. And we'll have to leave it there.
Tonight on First Tuesday, an international debate on the fallout from Chernobyl. How safe are Britain's nuclear plants?
The record of safety in design, operation and maintenance and inspection of this country is second to none.
And what are the implications worldwide for nuclear energy now? Good evening and welcome to First Tuesday. It's now just over a week since the word Chornobyl reverberated across the world for the first time. As the details began to emerge, it soon became clear that this was not just another accident, but a major nuclear disaster with repercussions of the greatest significance for all of us. So in this special 90-minute edition of First Tuesday, we'll be trying to answer some of the fundamental questions raised by the fact that for the first time in the history of nuclear power, the apparently impossible has come to pass. What is the extent of the Chernobyl disaster? Could it happen again elsewhere? Could it happen here? What are the repercussions for the nuclear industry, which at the moment is expanding rapidly around the world? To help untangle some of those issues, we are linked by satellite to America, Austria, Sweden and France, from where, as from here in Britain, we'll be hearing the voices of senior officials, leading specialists, prominent critics and politicians, including the Secretary of State for Energy, Peter Walker. In addition, we'll be reporting the findings of a poll commissioned by First Tuesday to discover the impact of Chernobyl upon public opinion in this country. And of course, I'll be asking the studio audience here in Leeds what they think of what they hear in the programme. In the first part of this programme, we're going to look at the direct consequences of the disaster. And we'll start by trying to piece together the latest information about what in Soviet nuclear jargon is described as a maximum possible accident. This was Chernobyl before the catastrophe. It was a much publicised power plant, advertised as a showpiece of the Soviet nuclear power programme. The Russians said it was fail-safe. According to Moscow, the risk of disaster, 1 in 10,000 years. It survived for 10. Sometime at the end of last week, there was apparently a human error. At the core of the reactor, 190 tons of uranium fuel passed combustion point and Chernobyl exploded, releasing a huge cloud of radioactivity into the atmosphere. At first, the Russians were silent. It was not until scientists at the Forsmark nuclear plant in Sweden detected a sudden increase of radioactivity that the rest of the world discovered what had happened. In the last week, the radioactive cloud has covered almost all Europe. In Britain, radioactivity has been up to 10 times normal. But the highest levels were recorded in Poland, where in some parts of the country, radioactivity has been 500 times above normal. Party officials believe that up to 500 cancers may be caused as a result.
Of course I am worried, as everyone here in Poland, because as a matter of fact we know next to nothing about what has happened.
10 million children have been fed iodine to counter the risk of thyroid cancer. Amid heightened public concern, 7 countries are testing or banning vegetables. In at least 5, milk is found to be contaminated and some sales are banned. In other countries, the level of radioactivity in fresh water is up to 100 times as high as normal. From Russia itself, though, information was at first sparse.
При аварии погибли 2 человека. Приняты первоочередные меры по ликвидации последствий аварии. В настоящее время радиационная обстановка на электростанции и прилегающей местности стабилизирована.
The first American assessments were far more alarming. The Russians were under enormous international pressure for more information, and gradually they began to provide it.
How could you have not warned Sweden, Norway, Poland, Finland, Austria, and all the rest of those surrounding countries? The world is appalled, Mr. Churkin.
It is my understanding that no harm was done, real harm in those countries which are adjacent to the Soviet Union, to the people who live there.
It's widely assumed the prime agricultural land in the Ukraine is poisoned, that rivers and reservoirs are contaminated. Although 50,000 people have been evacuated from the immediate area, it's feared that many, many Russians are likely to die in the months and years ahead from the effects of radiation. Well, there is the background as we have it so far, but to try and find out a little bit more about what is happening there and how extensive the disaster is, let's go straight away to Washington. And in Washington is Mr. Fitzhugh Green, who's a member of the President's Environmental Protection Agency and has been monitoring the disaster. How clear a picture, Mr. Green, do you now have?
Of what went on in the Soviet Union?
Precisely that.
We have a very incomplete picture because we have received no information directly from the Soviet Union. Our information is coming, alas, from secondary sources, from projected guesses as to what happened on the basis of readings of radioactivity, for example, that are being picked up in adjacent countries.
What's the kind of information you need in order to form a full judgment of what is happening?
Well, our interest, of course, is what do we need to tell our own citizens, both here and in countries around the world, in terms of their own health and safety. And it is from that attitude that we are trying to find out the clearest possible picture as to what happened and as to the size of the amount of emissions that came out of the accident.
Now, in the early days after the disaster, some of your colleagues in Washington were saying that perhaps 2,000 people have been killed, which was denounced in Moscow as a wild exaggeration. Do you now modify that estimate?
This was not an official estimate at any time. This is the task force put into being by President Reagan has been asked to monitor the situation so that we can advise our own citizens at home and abroad what's been happening. We have made a daily press advisory saying what the facts are as we see them through our efforts, and we have from the beginning made no estimate of the number of deaths that occurred in the Soviet Union. We have accepted at the level of 2. We have no indication that more were killed, and we have never said anything to that effect.
Do you have any sense altogether of how many victims there are likely to be as a consequence?
We can't possibly make that estimate without a great deal more knowledge as to the magnitude of the emissions that took place at the time of the accident. We don't even know when the accident took place.
Well, perhaps we can get that answered immediately. If you would pause a moment there while we go to London and Mr. Alexei Nikiforov, who's counselor at the Soviet Embassy. Mr. Nikiforov, when did the accident occur? And if I can ask at the same time, why couldn't the world have been told immediately?
It occurred on Saturday, and we have immediately proceeded to save the population immediately near the reactor area, as well as at the town where the workers of this plant, as well as the builders of further 2 reactors, live. So that was immediate task which we addressed ourselves to in first 4 to 6 hours. Later on, the scientists came on the spot, assessed the situation, and told us that there is no danger from the radioactive cloud, which has formed immediately after explosion, to the outside areas.
What do you mean by the outside areas?
I mean the areas outside of the Soviet Union.
Because there was a press conference at lunchtime today when one of your colleagues in Washington from the Energy Authority, environmentalists, said that the limited time and nature of the fallout meant that there was no considerable risk for people living outside. Are you saying that the European assessments, which are very, very different, are just completely wrong?
I would say that our assessment, and we base that on the assessment of the scientific nature, not the layman, is that it is not present a hazard to the health of the population outside of the immediate area of the accident. In fact, everybody in the Soviet Union knows about the accident, how nasty it is, but at the same time, we take it for what it is, without any kind of disproportionate alarmist overtones, which I hear in many other places.
Mr. Nikiforov, thanks for a moment. If you'll stay there, I'd like to go to Sweden now, if we can, to Gunnar Benson, Director General of the Radiation Protection Unit. You had the first knowledge of the fallout. You've just heard there the assessment from Mr. Nikiforov that there is no serious risk for people outside the immediate area. What is your judgment of that judgment?
That certainly depends on what you mean by serious injury. I'm sure it's correct if you mean immediate hazard to the health or even a risk of death. But if you're talking about late injuries such as cancer deaths, I'm fairly convinced that there may be a rather large number of cancer cases coming out in the future.
Would you like to put some rough estimate on the likely cancer sufferers as a consequence of the disaster?
Well, we have tried to make an estimate for Sweden, and this indicates that in Sweden the toll would run in 10 or maybe tens of victims over the next 40, 50 years or so. And whether you think this is much or not depends on if you think in relative terms, because in the same time in Sweden there will be about 1.5 million other cases of cancer which are not connected with the accident.
Now, some of your colleagues in your institute, as I understand it, are reported as saying that they think across Europe, outside the Soviet Union, there may well be something in the order over a period of years of 8,000 deaths?
Yes, we think that it's rather likely that the victims will run in the hundreds, and not at all unlikely that they may run into the thousands. And you only have to make the qualification that these are theoretical